Well, a friend of mine recently tied the knot, and it got me thinking about all the traditions and, well, the vocabulary that comes with getting married. You always find the most interesting stuff in your research. What can we expect on this deep dive into marriage?
Well, it's amazing how much the idea of marriage has changed over time, but it still has some really old roots. We're going to uncover some surprising things about everything from the wedding ceremony itself to the legal stuff that shapes how we say, I do.
Okay, let's break this down. Maybe we could start with the ceremony. You've been researching this. What are some of the traditional parts that have stuck around, and how are couples making them their own these days?
It's interesting how the ceremony mixes those old rituals with how people see them today. Take vows, for example. Exchanging vows is a huge part of lots of wedding ceremonies, and it goes back centuries. But the ways couples handle vows nowadays are so different.
Right, because when you think about traditional vows, they can sound kind of, well, outdated. How are couples personalizing their vows now?
We're seeing a shift from those standard pre-written vows to ways for couples to say what they really feel, sharing stories, writing their own promises, even adding in some humor or things they're both passionate about.
It's like moving away from a one-size-fits-all ceremony to something that shows who the couple really is. I love that. And speaking of reflecting the couple, what about the reception? Feels like there are so many options now.
Absolutely. Receptions have become like a blank canvas for couples to express themselves. But no matter the theme or style, there's one thing that's always at the center: celebrating the newly married couple with their closest friends and family.
That's interesting. You mentioned how vows have this history. Does that apply to receptions too?
It does. The way it looks has definitely changed, but having a celebratory feast after a wedding ceremony is something you can find across different cultures and throughout history. It's everyone recognizing this new bond, and that feeling of celebrating together goes beyond time periods and cultures.
That actually leads perfectly into something else I wanted to ask. We're going deep into the traditions. But what about the legal side of marriage? It's not exactly romantic, but it's definitely important.
For sure. And this is where marriage becomes a kind of contract. One legal aspect that's become more and more common is the prenuptial agreement or prenup.
Right, and it feels like prenups have gone from this taboo thing to something people talk about more openly now. What's causing that shift?
I think it's a few things combined. First, our views on marriage itself are changing. People are marrying later, often with more money and more complicated financial situations. So there's more emphasis on being open about finances and planning for the future, however that looks.
Like that saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, but not in a way that takes away from the love and commitment, right?
Exactly. It's not about not trusting each other. It's about being practical and protecting each other.
Okay, so we've covered prenups, which hopefully never have to be used. But what about when marriages do end? That's where things like divorce and alimony come in, right?
Oh, and these are areas where the legal side of marriage becomes really important.
Before we get into the details, can you explain the difference between divorce and alimony? People mix them up sometimes.
You're right, they often get used in the same way, but they mean different things. Divorce is the legal way to end a marriage, dissolving that legal bond. Alimony, though, is about financial support that one spouse might have to pay the other after a divorce.
So it's not automatic in every divorce.
Exactly. Whether or not alimony happens and for how long depends on a lot of things that the courts look at.
Like what? What influences those decisions?
There are a bunch of factors. How long the marriage lasted is a big one. Courts also consider how much each spouse can earn, their age and health, and if one spouse put their career on hold to support the other or raise children. It can be quite complicated.
Wow, okay. Sounds like alimony could be a whole other deep dive.
Definitely. It's a complex topic with a lot of legal and social angles.
So we've talked about prenups, which are all about planning for the what ifs, and touched on divorce and alimony, which happen if a marriage ends. It's a lot to take in. But you mentioned earlier that marriage isn't one size fits all, especially in different cultures. What do you mean by that?
This is where things get really interesting. The traditions and legal stuff around marriage can be totally different depending on where you are in the world and the culture.
Okay, give me an example. What's a tradition we might see in one part of the world that would be totally strange in another?
Hmm. Well, take the idea of a dowry. In some cultures, especially in parts of South Asia, a dowry is a big part of the marriage tradition. It's basically money or property that the bride's family gives to the groom or his family when they get married.
Interesting. So it's almost like the opposite of a prenup in a way, but instead of protecting things if they get divorced, it's more about giving the couple some financial stability to start their life together.
You could say that, although dowries have a complicated history and meaning depending on the society. It's a tradition that shows how different cultures look at the money side of marriage.
It makes you think about how much our own culture shapes how we see something like marriage, even though it seems so universal.
Definitely. It reminds us that there's no one right way to approach marriage. It's all these traditions, legal things, and personal choices mixed together.
And speaking of choices, I'm curious about those alternatives to traditional marriage that are becoming more popular. You've been looking into that, right? What trends are you seeing?
We're seeing more couples choosing things like domestic partnerships or cohabitation agreements. These give a lot of the same legal protections and benefits as marriage, but without the traditional label or ceremony.
It's pretty fascinating, right? It's like the whole idea of what it means to be committed is changing and going beyond those old definitions. Why do you think more people are going for these alternatives?
I think there are a few reasons. Some people want to avoid the historical baggage that comes with marriage, especially groups who have been left out of traditional marriage in the past. For others, it's about practicality and having options, fitting their commitment to their own situation.
So it's about having more choices and finding what matches your values and how you live, which, when you think about it, is what being consciously committed is all about.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's not about everyone fitting into the same idea of marriage, but finding your way to be committed.
And being open to all the different ways people are choosing to do that these days. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. We've covered everything from ancient traditions to how people are doing things now, explored legal stuff, and even touched on how commitment itself is changing. Before we wrap up, is there anything else about marriage, maybe a surprising fact or something to think about that our listeners should ponder?
Well, one thing that often gets overlooked is the idea of annulment. It's like divorce, but with a totally different legal outcome.
Oh, right, annulment. It's not as common, but I know it comes up sometimes. So how is it different from a divorce? I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
So imagine divorce as erasing the marriage from the point of divorce forward. Annulment, though, is like saying the marriage was never valid to begin with. It's like hitting the undo button on the whole marriage.
Wow, that's a powerful way to think about it. What are the grounds for getting an annulment? Is it just we changed our minds?
It's definitely more complicated than that. Annulments are usually granted for very specific reasons, like if the marriage wasn't legal in the first place, maybe because of bigamy or something, or if there was fraud or coercion involved.
Like someone lying about their identity or being forced into marrying? That makes sense.
Exactly. Or sometimes it's about things that happened before the marriage, like one person not being of legal age to consent or being closely related without knowing it.
Okay, so annulment is about more serious issues than just having second thoughts. It's like saying the foundation of the marriage was flawed from the start.
Precisely. It's a fascinating area of family law, and it highlights just how complex these commitments can be.
That's for sure. Well, I've got to say, this deep dive has been enlightening. We've gone from the joyous traditions to the legal intricacies and everything in between. It's really got me thinking about how marriage is more than just a one-time event. It's this evolving journey, right?
Absolutely. And what I find most intriguing is how traditions, laws, and personal choices all intertwine to shape what marriage means in the 21st century. It's truly a reflection of our evolving values and how we choose to build our lives with one another.
It's been such a pleasure picking your brain about all of this today. Thanks for sharing your insights.
Anytime. I always enjoy these conversations.